Good afternoon, dear boys. It's another opportunity that I want to welcome you to our normal online lessons. Remember, we are looking at glaciation. We began by looking at definitions of terms. Then we looked at erosional features in the glaciated upland. We moved ahead to look at erosional features in the glaciated lowlands, which included Chi, Moutoni, crag and tail, depressions, and ice eroded plains. Boys, yesterday I told you that glaciation is the process by which glacier erodes, transports, and deposits materials on the surface of the earth. Now, we have looked at how glacier erodes, and after erosion, what we now move to is transportation. It is important, dear boys, to note that materials which are transported by glacier and deposited by glacier are known as moraine. Remember, glacier travels within the glacial trough or U-shaped valley. Now, boys, depending on the position on which these materials which are transported by glacier are, there are 5 types of moraine that you need to know. Which are these types of moraine? We have lateral moraine, number 1. Number 2, we have medial moraine. Number 3, we have terminal moraine. Number 4, we have subglacial, which is also referred to as ground moraine. And number 5, we have englacial moraine. Allow me, boys, to take you through the different moraine, that is, materials that are transported by glacier. Number 1, lateral moraine. Which type of moraine are these, boys? These are materials which are transported by glacier on the sides of the glacial trough. They are materials that move on sides of the glacial valley or U-shaped valley. After looking at lateral moraine, it is important that we look at number 2, medial moraine. What are medial moraine? Boys, medial moraine are materials which are carried on the surface but in the middle of the valley. As much as they are being carried on the surface of the glacial trough, they are in the middle of the glacial trough. Can we now look at the third type of moraine? And this is englacial moraine. Boys, these are materials that are carried within the glacier and they may not be visible at all because they are covered with glacier as glacier moves, since they are embedded within the glacier. Let's look at the fourth type of moraine, terminal moraine. Boys, these are materials deposited at a point where the glacier melts. They are normally deposited at the snow line before the glacier melts. Such materials are called terminal moraine. The last material, dear boys, is known as subglacial or ground moraine. These are low debris which are embedded beneath the glacier and dragged along the valley floor. In other words, boys, these are materials that are carried between the glacier and the rocks within the valley. After looking at the 5 types of moraine, that is lateral moraine, medial moraine, terminal moraine, subglacial moraine, and englacial moraine, it is now important, boys, that we look at glacial deposition. After glacier has eroded, glacier transports, glacier will now deposit. What are the conditions that are necessary for glacier to deposit materials? Or what are the conditions that lead to deposition of the glacial materials in the lowlands? Condition number 1, the gradient of the land. What do we mean, boys? The land should be relatively flat to allow accumulation of large ice sheet and subsequent deposition of fluvial glacial materials. What are fluvial glacial materials? These are materials that are deposited by melting water from ice. The second condition, boys, which will lead to deposition in the lowland is stagnation of the glacier, which leads to pressure being exerted at the base of the glacier, and in turn, this leads to melting at the base. The meltwater then carries and deposits material underneath the ice. Factor number 3, boys, that will lead to deposition of the materials carried by the glacier is known as friction. Friction between the moving ice and the rock surface leads to deposition of the materials underneath the ice. Factor number 4, we have seasonal melting of ice, which allows materials embedded within the ice to be released for deposition. Then we have rising temperature, which leads to melting of ice, thereby releasing the load for deposition. We have amount of glacial drift or amount of moraine. A lot of moraine cause glacier to become too heavy, forcing it to be deposited or forcing it to deposit some of the loads it is carrying. Boys, after looking at the conditions which are necessary for deposition of glacier, it is equally important that we know depositional features in the glaciated lowlands. Remember, we looked at depositional features in the glaciated highland. I hope that you can remember that we looked at depositional features in the glaciated highland. And which were these features, boys? The depositional features in the glaciated uplands were longitudinal ridge, and number 2 was transverse ridge. Now, what are the depositional features in the glaciated lowlands? We have eskers, we have boulder terrain, we have drumlin, we have camps, we have outwash plain, we have till or boulder clay, we have kettle lakes, and we have moraine dammed lakes. It is also important that we know that there are also erratics. Can we, boys, begin by looking at an esker? What is an esker, boys? An esker is a long, narrow, steep-sided ridge of coarse sand and gravel that is formed by streams of water that flows continuously beneath the ice. The streams form tunnel below the ice and flows under high pressure. When the tunnel roofs collapse, boys, the river slows down and deposits material to form ridges that are called eskers. Eskers may also form as Valley Glacier moves from a narrow section of the valley into a wider portion. Such surface, the surface of such glacier stretches out to fill the wider valley. Parallel crevices develop into which moraine are deposited. As ice wastes away, the moraine take a longitudinal alignment of the crevices they occupy, thereby forming a long winding ridge known as an esker. Boys, this brings us to the end of our online lesson today. In case you have any question, then you may ask that question in our usual WhatsApp group. May all of you have a good evening.